Welcome to this edition of Diligent Institute's Inside Today's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about how compensation committees should balance SEC disclosures with internal pay-for-performance evaluations. And joining me to have this technical discussion is Andrew McElheran, who's a partner with Meridian Compensation Partners. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Andrew, it's come to my attention from more experienced compensation committee chairs that what information that the SEC wants in its new pay for performance disclosures is not necessarily in sync with how one should structure the internal executive pay plan to deliver pay for performance. Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, I think you could say that the new required pay versus performance disclosure rules are a bit better than what we've had to rely on in the past, which is just what a public company puts in its summary compensation table, but not by much. The new rules don't define realized or realizable compensation in any way that could help a compensation committee member really understand the question of whether they're fulfilling what most would say is a key mission, and that is the executive pay program delivering good pay for performance alignment. Rather, we've learned over the last few months since these rules were released that they take a one-size-fits-all approach, including a requirement that companies measure what is called compensation actually paid in ways that are misleading or at least not very informative. But the new rules are prompting, I think, a very good thing, which is, if not like this, as the rules say, what would be a better way to define pay for performance alignment? And what should we be doing now that we're not currently doing? And that leads to lots of interesting questions on both sides of the equation, both in terms of how you calculate pay, be it in realized or realizable terms, and in terms of how you define performance.
In the perfect world, in your opinion, what should the plan, the internal plan, I guess it is, be compared to? Peers, investor experience, internal plan and budget? What's your opinion?
I think the answer is all three. I think all of these perspectives are useful and informative, and they're interrelated. The sort of classic approach, and the one that some of the public companies we work with do, is we understand that companies measure pay and performance relative to some peer group or market reference. And the natural starting point is to take this group and measure outcomes in realized and or realizable terms over a trailing historical period and compare that to those same companies. And then you'd also do the same thing looking at performance on a series of indicators. I think this is important, that it's not a single indicator that you would look at, typically including total shareholder return, but also including other financial or operational metrics defined in terms that make sense for the company itself. So you take that composite view of performance. That's probably the key starting point. But relatedly, one question we look at often is how have investors done, and what's that ratio of sharing between value created for investors over a period of time and compensation outcomes delivered to executives. We sometimes refer to this as a millions for billions analysis. It has its limitations. We don't have great comparative data on just what the right fraction or sharing ratio between investors and executives ought to be. But you can look at your own company performance longitudinally through history. And you might think about the acid test of any pay for performance analysis would be, are investors happy to pay for what they have received in terms of return on their investment? And then thirdly, you can take the external dimensions aside, the peer group or the shareholder experience, and just look at it purely from the company's own goals. If there are question marks, particularly around how much stretch is built into incentive plan performance goals, it could be worth taking a look at how those outcomes compare to what the original goals were over time. Does the company demonstrate a pattern of setting goals and exceeding them cycle to cycle, or equivalently setting less challenging goals cycle to cycle and then meeting those. And our view is that it's important to consider all of these perspectives because one perspective alone might not tell the story adequately or accurately.
So I have to smile when I hear all the technical part that is involved and think back 20 years ago when people were um, not hesitant to join a compensation committee because it was, a pretty easy gig. But today, I almost think that it probably rivals the necessity to be informed as much as the audit committee does. So it's not so much a walk in the park, but from your experience in so many compensation committees and in boardrooms, what advice would you give compensation committees about going through this process? I guess both making sure you're meeting the disclosures, but most importantly, and why this is, I'm sure it's being done from a reporting sense, is making sure you get it right internally.
Yeah, this is prompting, as I noted, a lot of good thinking about. So the SEC is requiring this disclosure, and companies will do that, of course. I suspect they'll treat it as more of a compliance exercise for the reasons I outlined, that you're not necessarily going to get a good, accurate evaluation of whether there's pay and performance alignment. So when I think about this and when I advise committees, there's really three elements that come to mind. The first is understand that pay for performance evaluation isn't a one-shot exercise. At least most companies aren't so lucky that that's the case. Many that we work with will do a formal annual or every other year evaluation of pay for performance evaluation, get the report, and satisfy themselves that things look okay, a bit like a 10,000-mile checkup on a car. And taking the time to do a formal check-in and look at pay for performance officially is an important step. But it's not the only step. And honestly, this question comes up all the time in the background as the compensation committee does its work. Starting with what's the mix of incentive compensation vehicles and the structure of the program. Is it believed on its face that that's going to deliver good pay for performance alignment? Crucially, when the performance goals are set, is there reason to believe that there's enough stretch built into those goals, or are they viewed as potentially too soft or equivalently too hard? For public companies, of course, the signal they get from their say on pay vote results and in the commentary that the proxy advisory firms will provide to that company prior to that vote taking place. Now, those are often imperfect signals, but the signals are there. And so if there's information coming back in that say on pay vote that all might not be well, companies should at least consider that and take it seriously. Now, some of these are philosophical questions. And if the company hasn't considered its compensation philosophy, it should do so. To use an obvious example, a high risk, high leverage program with lots of volatility in the payout outcomes is not inherently a better pay for performance model than one that is lower risk, lower leverage, and potentially lower volatility in the payout outcomes. So those questions don't naturally assume that one approach is better than another. And so that's part of the background conversation that's always taking place at the compensation committee. Secondly, anticipate that this story usually takes more than a single cycle to be told. So when we do a formal pay for performance evaluation on behalf of a company, sometimes the outcome looks like there might be a problem here. And our advice at that point generally is, let's investigate a little further, even to the point of repeating the evaluation in a year's time. See if the misalignment or apparent misalignment is still there. But one thing we don't often advise, at least right off the bat, is you've got a problem that requires an immediate solution, so we need to move into design phase and start proposing changes to the program right now. I would say a company, for example, that has a string of above plan or above target performance outcomes and therefore payout outcomes doesn't automatically have a pay for performance problem. What it could mean is that the company has an excellent management team in place. And so our advice generally at this juncture is let the evidence accumulate, investigate further as required, and if necessary, consider design revisions over a longer time frame. And then the third, and this is probably where many compensation committees are going to think more in the year to come, as we get the first round of mandated pay versus performance disclosures. One question is, when you're telling your pay for performance story in your own terms, how much of this is for the committee's consumption and benefit, and how much of it ought to go into the story that you tell the world? It's probably a true statement that the total corpus of pay for performance evaluation that a company does is going to be larger than what you might put in your compensation discussion analysis in your proxy. So worth asking the question, do we want all of this information out there and exposed for the world to see, or some of it, or none of it? And right now, many companies are considering, well, we have to do this mandated disclosure. Does that mean we should cease to talk about pay for performance alignment in any other terms in our proxy, or should we supplement that? And the classic advice that we always offer here is, if you're thinking about making this disclosure and talking about pay for performance using demonstrated evidence, demonstrated analytical frameworks in your proxy, be prepared to do that when their story is good, as well as when the story is potentially not good. And I think that's what's prompted many companies to hold back on disclosing all of the pay for performance analysis that they have done historically. I suspect that balance is going to change, but the general advice of make sure you're comfortable with making that a permanent fixture in your proxy, that advice still holds.
Well, that certainly sounds like great advice for anybody that's sitting on a compensation committee today. And I don't have to tell any of the viewers about how focused shareholders and investors are on compensation these days. It seems like everybody in the world is a compensation expert, but the point is that with say on pay and all that, it matters, and it matters to investors that you're rewarding people for the right behavior. So, Andrew, I appreciate you taking the time. Obviously, this is, again, a technical topic that somebody's got to be knowledgeable about compensation to really enter. And that's the job of the compensation committee. So we'll hope that this is helpful and that we can make sure that people are getting off on the right foot. So thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
And that will conclude this edition of Diligent Institute's Inside Today's Boardrooms. Hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.